task. He was deeply involved in the evaluation framework, which took place in 1994. He worked with Dr. Carucci, invested Dr. Carucci very closely, and they published a book under the title Going Critical. But apart from that, he has been most seasoned and sensible commentator on North Korean issue. He's one of very few endangered species who has a center of rationality in Washington. In Washington, I'm always disappointed by the bandwagon effect. If one maybe they say that we cannot trust the Kim Jong-un, we're very skeptical of the future of North Korean nuclear negotiations. There are about 80 or 90 folks in Washington with bandwagon and say that he's a hopeless, pessimistic, all these kinds of things. But Dora Wit, along with Leon Siegel and some others, have been very. They know North Korea. They have been negotiating with North Korea for a long time. There are some of very few who would have a sense of rationality and a sense of guarded optimism in dealing with North Korea. Therefore, it is my great pleasure to invite Dora Wit here and make Daniel to have his presentation. He will give about 30 to 40 minutes, and that will be followed by the Q&A session. Given the size of audience, and we have a lot of so-called diplomats and a lot of journalists, therefore we might have a lot of questions like is the second U.S. DPRK talk summit will take place, what is the nature of it, all these kinds of things. We can ask those kind of things to Joel. Let us give a big applause to Joel.
Thanks, Chung-In. Is this necessary, or can everyone hear me, or? It's better? Okay, I'm from New York, so I'm very loud, and I thought, this is a small room, okay, but anyway, I'm not used to having a handheld mic, but thanks, Chung-In. I'm really happy to be here. I've never been to this facility before. It looks very impressive. And I'm actually a great admirer of Kim Dae-jung, and I thought I'd start, since we're having this here, with a funny story about Kim Dae-jung and one of my first personal encounters with him. And it was before he became president. This was, I think, in late 1994 or 1995. And I was at the State Department working for Bob Gallucci, and we had a small office. It was just me, Gary Seymour, who many of you may know, and Bob, and a couple of secretaries. And so in walked Kim Dae-jung to meet with Bob. He was by himself, obviously before he became president. And at the time, we were working very hard to establish the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, KEDO. And one of our biggest problems was getting money for the organization. And at times it was frustrating, and so just to relieve some of the frustration, we took a plastic cup and wrote on the front KEDO and put it on the secretary's desk, and we would throw pennies and nickels in there as part of our fundraising effort. And so President Kim had this meeting with Bob, and he was leaving Bob's office, about to walk out the door, and he spotted this tin cup, the plastic cup, on the secretary's desk. He stopped, he pulled it, reached into his pocket, and put a $5 bill into the cup, which was very kind of him. And of course, we all sort of laughed, and we sort of said to him, this is just a joke, to relieve our stress, and he laughed along with us. So it was a very nice human encounter with him. And I hesitate to talk about President Kim and President Trump in the same breath, because one was obviously, or I think, a great man with vision. President Trump, well, I'm not sure. I'm not a big fan of President Trump. And I should say that up front, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But in a strange kind of way, it takes someone like Kim Dae-jung, a man of vision, or someone like President Trump, who really hasn't given any thought to Korea or the problem of Korea, North Korea, to deal with this issue. I'll explain that in a minute, but anything in between doesn't seem to work in Washington. And this is, I am about to say things that are going to second what Jung-in has said. I think we all know by now that President Trump's big motivation on any issue is to make deals. Any deals. The deals that he makes are always better than anyone else's deals. And that, of course, stands in stark contrast to the rest of the U.S. foreign policy establishment when it comes to North Korea. I may have been doing this too long. I've been doing it about 25 years, starting in the State Department and outside of the State Department. And I've come to the conclusion recently that whether it's the public, the media, the foreign policy establishment in the United States, the myths about North Korea and the myths about U.S.-North Korean relations are so pervasive that it's almost impossible to build a rational policy towards North Korea. And I think anyone who's followed this issue closely, I mean, all you have to do is read the media, and you see it every day, not just now, but you know, over the years, whether it's Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un, who are crazy and funny looking, whether it's North Korea as a hermit state, North Korea is a failed, weak state on the verge of collapse. And there's, of course, there's the American version of history, which is North Korea isn't really interested in talking, cheats on all its agreements, and it's able to fool the naive Americans every time we talk to them. And I think everyone remembers the Obama administration's slogan about not buying the same horse twice. This goes on and on and on, and I can tell you, even today, when I sit in meetings, I sat in a meeting yesterday, and I heard these myths from other Americans sitting there. They permeate the foreign policy establishment in the United States. And of course, there are many smart people in that establishment, but they just don't know how to deal with this problem. And I'm not claiming North Korea is unique either. All you have to do is look at the history of U.S. foreign policy since World War II, and you see lots of examples where the U.S. just doesn't or didn't get it. And of course, the prime example is Vietnam. Of course, we've seen Iraq, we see Afghanistan. There are lots of examples. The problem is it's dangerous if you don't get it. You know, I don't want to launch into a blanket condemnation of the foreign policy establishment. And in that context, I've been working on a book on Obama, Trump, and North Korea for the past year. I've done about 175 interviews of former government officials. And I knew already before I started the book that one of the main heroes of the story was going to be Steve Bosworth, who I think, as many of you know, passed away a few years ago. He was the Obama administration's special envoy. He was a close friend of Kim Dae-jung. And he was a card-carrying member of the U.S. foreign policy establishment. But he was a rare bird who had experience, not just with the region, but with Korea, with North Korea, and he believed in the power of diplomacy. think this last job that Steve had was probably his most challenging. And it wasn't his most challenging job because he had to deal with a North Korea that was in transition. You remember Kim Jong-il had a stroke in August 2008, and for the next few years until he died, North Korea was transitioning to his son taking over. But almost as hard for Steve was this uphill battle he had inside the Obama administration to put together what would be a rational policy. And part of that battle was dealing with the belief that the highest levels of that administration, that North Korea was nothing more than a crime family and should be treated that way. It wasn't like Iran, it wasn't a state, it was a crime family. Nevertheless, even as a part-time envoy, Steve managed to rekindle talks. He did that because he could see at the end of the day that without reaching agreements with North Korea, the United States would be faced with a stark choice. And I think he was right. Either we had to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state or fight a devastating war on the peninsula. And he did all of this without ever meeting President Obama. He never met President Obama, never had a chance to make his case face to face. And even worse, he managed to start talks that led to the 2012 weekday deal, but left before the deal was reached, not because he was ill, but because the administration left him no choice but to resign. President Trump has cut through these prevailing views in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the prevailing wisdoms on North Korea, and gone straight for the deal. And he's not just gone for the deal, but he's gone for the deal through summons. And that may seem reckless. Certainly it's been criticized as reckless by many experts in the United States, but for those of us with experience dealing with North Korea, the Holy Grail has always been to reach to the center of the North Korean government, the leader, and see if the deal is possible. And that hasn't happened often. Everyone remembers Jimmy Carter met with Kim Il-sung in 1994. I thought, and I think people I work with thought that was a good thing, but a lot of Americans thought it wasn't. And I think that's discouraged people from trying to do that ever since, at least at that level. And the Obama administration tried to reach to the center through secret talks with the North Koreans, including a number of visits by senior CIA officials to Pyongyang to discern if Kim Jong-un was willing to strike a deal. It's not just President Trump who I think deserves some credit here. Of course, President Moon deserves a lot of credit. He's played a central role in this drama. And he's continuing to do that, playing the role of intermediary. But I would note that, and I haven't finished my research on this, but everyone thinks that the summit proposal in March 2000 it was March of this year. God, it feels like so much time has gone by. Everyone thinks that was all of a sudden. It was a surprise. You know, the North Koreans had never raised that before. But in fact, they had raised it before. They raised it before in the spring of 2017 with U.S. diplomats while negotiations were underway to secure the release of Otto Warmbier. But unfortunately, the drastic turn of events in 2017, that summer, that fall, cut short that conversation. The contrast between President Trump's approach and the U.S. establishment came to sharp view with the drama that began earlier this year as the United States and South Korea shifted into high gear in summer diplomacy. And you know, having to run a website, I have to follow the media closely, I have to follow what everyone's saying closely, and you could see this very clearly with the criticism from foreign policy experts of President Trump's Singapore summit, criticism of his accepting the summit, criticism of what happened at the summit, and of course criticism that has continued since the summit. And I believe if you could pull back the curtain on U.S. decision making, you'd see it in behind the scenes jockeying between the president, who really brings nothing to the table other than his belief in the art of the deal, and the traditional foreign policy establishments in the administration, who I know what they're arguing. I don't have to be sitting at the table. They're arguing that Kim Jong-un isn't serious. They ignore or dismiss the very surprising unilateral steps he's taken already. And now they're arguing, of course, for full disclosure up front of North Korea's declaration of everything about North Korea's nuclear program. And the North Koreans have to do that first before the U.S. does anything. And, you know, when I see this in the media, I just have to laugh. Because, once again, the 25 years of experience, I can't tell you how many times American officials have said, North Korea has to go first before we do anything. And it reminded me of a time when I was in a meeting with John Kerry, who was not the Secretary of State, he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Madam Chae Sung-hee, who is now, I guess, the North Korean negotiator, and John Kerry sitting there saying, North Korea has to go first before we do anything. And I knew that was going to trigger a reaction. And of course, Madam Chae, who, I don't know if I call her fearless, but she's certainly very tough, she chimed in right away and said, why should we have to go first? You're the world's only superpower. We're just a small country. You should go first. And I'm sure that's the North Korean reaction today. It's very clear from everything they've said publicly. And you can see the sort of criticism, certainly in the media, respected media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. They've all of whom sounded an alarm in 2017 about the possibility of war, now are almost relentless in their criticism of the administration's diplomacy towards North Korea. And I had a chuckle a few weeks ago. There was a headline in the New York Times on Foreign Minister Ri's speech at the UN, and it read something like, North Korea demands concessions in return for denuclearization. Well, okay, yeah, sure. Is this surprising? So it reflects this sort of mindset in the United States that I think has really worked against us. Having said all that, I don't want to seem like I'm one of these people who go on TV every night and defend President Trump. I'm not. And I think there are serious problems with the Trump administration's approach to North Korea. It's pretty clear that the administration has been disorganized and unfortunately not as productive in terms of its substantive thinking as it should have been. There's another serious problem, which is obvious to everyone, maybe not to everyone in the administration, but the United States can't pursue this policy alone. And certainly we're working with South Korea, but what about China and Russia? And that's become painfully obvious recently with this trilateral meeting between China, Russia, and North Korea, with our efforts to keep up this policy of maximum pressure, which we can't keep up without China or Russia. It's not brain surgery to figure that out, but I guess the administration hasn't quite done that yet. But I think the most dangerous downside here is the most obvious one, which is President Trump is erratic, he's divisive, and I think destructive in both his conduct of domestic and foreign policy, and he could go off the rails. He could swing back to confrontation if things don't go well. Or at the other extreme, and we've seen signs of this too, if he may agree to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region, from the peninsula, and maybe even the region, because he thinks it costs too much. All of this needs to be avoided, and it needs to be avoided for two reasons. First, this is enormously complicated, dealing with 60 years of Cold War confrontation. How do you unwind that? You can't do it overnight. And it's a real challenge to propel this process forward. You've got denuclearization, that's the nuclear part. You've got North Korea's missile program. You've got reaching permanent peace arrangements. You've got normalization of relations. You may have conventional arms reduction talks. You may need to establish normal economic relations. You've got human rights, on and on and on. This is a lot to deal with for any government. And it's not just negotiating the arrangements. Try to think even further down the road. Think about implementing these agreements. I had the experience of having to implement one agreement in 1994 after the agreement was reached. It was part of my responsibilities to manage the implementation. And that was complicated. That was difficult. I mean, really difficult. And that was just one specific agreement. So implementing these arrangements, if they're reached, is going to be enormously complicated organizationally. It's going to require a lot of money. It's going to require a lot of manpower. And it's going to require, most of all, cooperation among the various parties. The second reason to keep Trump from veering off the rails is that I think we're entering, if this process moves forward, a slow evolutionary process that changes the geopolitics of Northeast Asia away from the previous confrontation that's dominated the region. And I have a sense that's obvious, or more obvious to people here in the region than it is in Washington, where most people either live in a bubble, or they want to resist change at all costs. This change clearly has important implications for the future of our alliance, and I think that's why you're seeing a number of statements that U.S. troops can stay here even after unification. And it has important implications, broader implications for U.S. policy in the Pacific. So these are the main challenges in Washington today: to deal with the downsides of President Trump, to harness the momentum that we've established since the beginning of the year, and to propel it forward in ways that keep in mind where we want to head as we do move forward. So how do we do all this? It's a tall order, so I just have a few ideas. But first, we need to recognize President Trump's style isn't going to change. He is who he is. A number of leaders flatter him, and it seems to work. It seems to get him to, support whatever they're doing. But we also need to establish stronger guardrails to keep him on the road. And in that context, let me talk about the midterm elections that are coming up in the United States. I know everyone thinks, well, gee, what are the implications of the midterm elections? And everyone's thinking, if Democrats take the House, this could be bad. They could, it could undermine President Trump's efforts with North Korea, and that's possible, but I think it's also quite possible, and certainly it's desirable, that while there may be renewed tensions or more tensions between Congress and the White House, it's desirable to try to build bipartisan support for President Trump's efforts on North Korea. And I think that there are a number of Democrats who are willing to go along, because at least the progressive part of the Democratic Party a year or so ago was concerned we were almost on the brink of war. So I think they are willing to support President Trump, but at the same time try to keep him from veering off in strange directions. And so I think there's already been some legislation that's aimed at that, and there may be more in the future after the elections. Second, with regard to the specific issues that we're facing, there's been a lot of talk about dismantling Yonbyon. What does denuclearization mean? You know, it just goes on and on and on. What I would say is we need to, of course, move down this road, but we need to combine practical measures with increasing transparency. I think it's a serious mistake to focus on getting all this information on North Korea's W1B programs up front, because the process is going to stall. It'll be very difficult to deal with that information. So what we need to do is combine practical steps with increasing transparency, and we have the opportunity to do this. Dismantlement of Yonbyon, if it's done right, and the disabling part of it can actually be done fairly quickly. That's what we should be doing, but at the same time, I think we should be going beyond that and seek an initial tranche of information on North Korea's nuclear program. Not a full declaration, but an initial installment on their program. And taking a step back for a moment, no one ever talks about the missile program. It seems to me that's sort of part of what we're trying to do. Everyone says denuclearization, but it's not just denuclearization, it's also the missile program. So I think we need to also there, and it may be possible to push for something more complete in terms of a declaration about North Korea's missile program, and seek steps to build on what they're already willing to do, which is to dismantle their main space launch facility. A lot of people dismiss that as not important. I think it's incredibly significant, because for years we've all been worrying about this space launch program and how it served as a loophole for agreements. Witness the 2012 weekday deal that collapsed because of a space launch, and also as a cover for continuing building ballistic missiles. Not to mention the fact that North Korea spent a lot of money building Sohae. I don't know the exact amount, but it's probably tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's not meaningless. There are things we can do beyond that to move that part of the process forward. Third, I think we should be thinking about how to accelerate the process as much as possible. By that I mean not just technical fixes, but I think we should be considering a willingness to give more to get more. In my mind, the main card that we could try to play closer to the front of this process is the establishment of liaison offices in Washington and Pyongyang. Establishment of liaison offices is basically establishing diplomatic relations. That's a big step, as far as I'm concerned. That's a big card. And I think we should be willing to play that card, but get a lot in return on the issues we would like to get a lot in return on. I have to add, I haven't thought about what exactly on the nuclear and missile issues Fourth, you know, the media in the United States, every time there's a meeting, they say it's make or break. You know, when Secretary Pompeo was supposed to go the time before this last one, and he canceled it, there was an article in the Washington Post that said, well, this visit's make or break. You know, I hesitate to say that. As far as I'm concerned, no visit is really make or break. But I think the next Trump-Kim summit really does have to have some more tangible results than the last summit. They need to beef up whatever comes out of it, whether it's more in a declaration, combined with some really tangible steps on both sides. So those are my 4 ideas, and I think, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'm going to stop now, and I welcome comments